Mirror Talk Episode 30. Integration and Authorship, Crafting Your Nervous System Vocabulary. Welcome back to Mirror Talk, the language of the nervous system. Take a breath with me, not a perfect breath, not a deep breath, just the one your body is already offering. Let it arrive exactly as it is. Let it land exactly where it lands. Today's episode is not just another chapter. It's a threshold, a hinge point, a quiet doorway where one layer of self-understanding exhales and another waits in the wings, not yet defined, but already humming beneath the surface. Your living lexicon, integration, and authorship. The final episode of Layer 3, Deep Mirrors. And in a way, everything we've explored across these layers, across the journey through this body of work, has been leading you here to the moment where you no longer learn the language of the nervous system, but begin to speak it as your own. But before we trace the contours of today's exploration, I want to place you inside the wider constellation, the larger arc you've been walking, listening, reading, and integrating across multiple worlds. Not as a biography, note à résumé, not as a list of projects, but as a continuum of inquiry, a living ecology of ideas, each one forming the scaffolding for the next. Because the nervous system does not grow in leaps. It grows in layers, in lexicon, in languages learned, unlearned, and reauthored. So let's begin there, the constellation of work that led us here. If you're not familiar with my other projects, I want to take the opportunity to introduce you to them. The Inversiverse, where reality is inverted, illusions are decoded, and perception becomes a navigable terrain rather than a passive inheritance. It introduced the structural foundation, indoctrination, identity, power, social scripts, and the architecture of belief. The unfiltered human on the fringe, where the shadow emotions were given oxygen, lust, shame, apathy, and anger, not as flaws but as data. It brought the raw human truth out of hiding and honored the stories beneath survival. The Body Knows, a series devoted to the physiological intelligence beneath cognition, the embodied truth teller we are never taught to hear. The Linguaverse, the home of my intricate theory, the nervous system language, NSL, and the mirror linguistic hypothesis, MLA, a framework that reframes language as biology, tone as regulation, and speech as an extension of the autonomic system. The Linguaverse Presence, the shadow spectrum, a forensic study of the human psyche, the archetypes, distortions, shadows, and emotional ecosystems that shape our internal voice. My books, The Inversiverse, Waking Up in a World Built to Keep You Asleep, a foundational text, a thorough investigation and disclosure of perception, indoctrination, and critical self-awareness. My Inner Child Was Broken, a reflective, psychological, and emotional excavation of early wounds, generational echoes, and the long arc of healing that follows. Across all of these works, one thread appears again and again. Language is the operating system of human experience, but the nervous system is its power source, and Mirror Talk, especially Layer 3, has been the bridge between those worlds. Layer 1 taught awareness, Layer 2 taught regulation, Layer 3 taught translation, how to hear what your body is saying before the sentence forms in your mind. Today, we bring all of that together. A moment to arrive before we step into the architecture of an inner lexicon. Pause again. Notice the rhythm of your breath. Notice the quiet behind your thoughts. Notice the way your body leans toward the familiar and retreats from the overwhelming. You don't need to correct anything. You don't need to understand everything. You just need to be here. Because this episode is not about learning something new. It's about recognizing what has already been forming inside you, slowly, steadily, quietly across all these layers. Your own nervous system vocabulary. Your own grammar of self-attunement. Your own lexicon of truth. And if the previous episodes were mirrors, some gentle, some confronting, then this one is a window into authorship, into sovereignty, into what it means to speak from coherence rather than conditioning. Layer 3, Deep Mirrors, has been dedicated to the interior landscape beneath language. The subconscious voice, the shadow dialects, cultural mimicry, linguistic inheritance, somatic silence, digital distortion, intuition, synchronicity, and symbolic communication. This layer has asked you to listen not to the words you use, but to the rhythms that produce them, to the nervous system states beneath the syllables, to the patterns that sculpt your inner narrator. And now, this final episode brings the focus inward, not to the voices you inherited, or the voices you absorbed, or the voices you perform, but to the voice you're in the process of becoming. Because if there is one truth that has echoed throughout this entire body of work, it is this. Your voice is not something you find. It is something you build, sentence by sentence, state by state, breath by breath. And that construction, that internal architecture, is what today's episode illuminates. Why this episode matters: self-forgiveness, intuition, shadow integration, cultural identity, collective resonance. All of these episodes have explored how we speak, why we speak, and who is speaking within us. But none have answered the deepest question. What is the language you are writing your life in? Not the one your parents taught you, not the one your culture rewarded, not the one your trauma rehearsed, not the one the algorithms mimic for you, not the one you perform, but the one that emerges naturally when the nervous system is coherent enough to author reality rather than survive it. This episode is about that language, your living lexicon, the internal vocabulary that shapes your decisions, your boundaries, your desires, your grief, your self-worth, your relationships, your intuition, your emotional truth. Every individual being operates from a personal lexicon, whether conscious or unconscious. Most people never update it. They spend a lifetime repeating the grammar of childhood and the syntax of survival. But you, here now, have the rare opportunity to rewrite it, to listen to the nervous system not as an obstacle, but as an editor, to use language not as a cage, but as a tool, to speak not as a character in someone else's script, but as the author of your own internal world. This episode is the blueprint for that authorship. A brief pause before we begin. Let's settle once more. Place your attention in your body, not your mind. In your chest, your throat, your belly, your jaw, your breath. In the place where language becomes sensation before it becomes sound. Because everything we're about to explore begins there. In the liminal space where biology becomes belief, where emotion becomes narrative, and where the nervous system becomes the writer of your inner lexicon, where we explore how repeated phrases become internal architecture, how the nervous system learns through tone, not words, how identity is constructed from linguistic predictability, and how to finally identify which sentences you inherited and which ones you are now ready to rewrite. The lexicon you live in, not the one you chose. Every human being speaks two languages. The first is external, the language we use with other people, our public vocabulary, our social tone, our conversational style. The second is internal, the language we use with ourselves, our private lexicon, the phrases we repeat when no one else can hear, the words that shape our identity long before we articulate them out loud. This inner language is not random. It is structured, it is patterned, it is predictable, it has rules, rhythms, default phrases, emotional biases, and an entire cognitive grammar that shapes how you interpret yourself. But crucially, you did not write this inner lexicon. You inherited it. From parents, from childhood environments, from cultural expectations, from peer groups, from educational institutions, from moments of shame, praise, guilt, and fear, from algorithms and digital culture, from the tone of the people who shaped your nervous system before you ever developed the capacity for self-authorship. Before you wrote your first sentence, your body had already internalized thousands of them. So the starting point for this episode is simple, but foundational. Your inner lexicon is the architecture you live in, even if you didn't design the structure. Understanding that architecture is the first step toward reclaiming authorship. Neural predictive coding. The brain's need for linguistic stability. Modern neuroscience gives us a direct lens into why our inner language becomes so entrenched. Predictive coding models propose that the brain's primary goal is not to interpret reality, but to predict it. It seeks stability, coherence, and low error margins. Language is one of the most efficient tools for prediction. Repeated phrases become shortcuts, cognitive templates that tell the brain, this situation means this feeling means this mistake means this about me. This sensation equals danger or rejection or failure or obligation. Over time, these repeated linguistic predictions solidify into identity statements. A child who repeatedly hears, stop overreacting, don't be dramatic, be good, don't cause trouble, you're too sensitive, you should know better, will internalize these not as descriptions of behavior, but as descriptions of self. And because the brain prefers predictions over uncertainty, it keeps recycling these phrases, even when they hurt, even when they distort reality, even when they no longer fit. This is predictive coding's paradox. The brain would rather feel familiar than accurate, which means your inner lexicon will keep repeating old sentences long after they've expired, unless you intervene. Tone as habitat. Why the nervous system responds to rhythm, not logic. People often assume that the meaning of an inner phrase lies in the words, but neuroscience and trauma research show something different. The nervous system responds primarily to tone, not what you say to yourself, but how your body feels when you say it. Tone is the first language a developing human learns. Before vocabulary, before grammar, before conceptual thought, tone is the nervous system's primary map of safety. This is why an adult may intellectually understand a situation, but still feel terrified, ashamed, or frozen. The words have matured. The tone has not. Tone is a nervous system habitat, a familiar internal climate. If your early environment was unpredictable, critical, demanding, or emotionally inconsistent, your body learned to stabilize through hypervigilance. And hypervigilance has its own lexicon. What did I do wrong? I should have known better. It's my fault. I can't mess this up. They'll be disappointed. I need to try harder. Don't upset anyone. Don't say anything stupid. These sentences are not moral judgments. They are physiological strategies, linguistic defense mechanisms. The body learned to speak in the dialect of survival long before you learned the language of autonomy. Emotional rhythms. The grammar beneath grammar. Every lexicon has a grammar. Grammar determines how sentences fit together, how ideas are structured, and how meaning is created. Your inner lexicon also has grammar, not linguistic grammar, but emotional grammar. Emotional grammar decides which sentences your body prioritizes, which interpretations feel natural, which phrases sound true, which thoughts your nervous system accepts or rejects. Here are some examples of emotional grammar rules people unconsciously live by. Rule 1. Negative interpretations are safer than hopeful ones. This creates a lexicon of self-criticism, preemptive disappointment, self-policing, and internal bracing. Rule 2. Responsibility equals safety. This creates a lexicon of over-accountability, hyper-apology, and self-blame. Rule 3. Harmony is more important than honesty. This creates a lexicon of suppression, fawning, and rationalizing discomfort. Rule 4. If I understand everything, I can control the outcome. This creates a lexicon of over-analysis and cognitive over-functioning. These aren't moral failures. They are adaptive linguistic strategies. Your emotional grammar was shaped not by choice, but by exposure, by the tone, rhythm, and relational conditions you grew up inside. The work now is to update those grammar rules, not by force, but by awareness. Identity is a linguistic structure. People often think identity is a fixed trait, a personality, a set of characteristics, a story. But from a linguistic neurosystemic perspective, identity is more accurately described as the sum of the phrases you repeatedly believe. For example, I'm too much. I'm not enough. I always mess things up. No one really understands me. I should be further along. People get tired of me. Success doesn't feel safe. I need to earn rest. My emotions are inconvenient. I don't fit in anywhere. I can't trust my instincts. These are not truths. They are linguistic fossils, sediment layers from earlier developmental periods. Identity is simply the internalization of language that was repeated, reinforced, or left unchallenged. When someone begins healing, these phrases often feel like they are breaking apart. Not because the person has changed, but because the inner lexicon is being updated. Healing is the process of replacing inherited sentences with accurate ones. Not positive affirmations, not forced optimism, not bypassing, but linguistic, precision speaking to yourself in a vocabulary that matches your present day reality, not your childhood conditions. The environmental sources of your lexicon. To rewrite your lexicon, you first need to know where it came from. There are 5 primary sources. 1. Parental tone and relational atmosphere. Even when parents believe they are communicating love, the nervous system hears the tone of their survival. Anxiety, stress, withdrawal, anger, silence, unpredictability, emotional absence, perfectionism, guilt-based affection. These tones generate inner phrases such as, I need to be careful, I don't want to be a burden, I must manage their emotions, it's safer if I stay quiet. 2. Cultural linguistics. Cultural values create entire internal dialects. Duty, modesty, self-sacrifice, achievement, emotional restraint, perfectionism, and compliance. These shape identity scripts like I should be grateful, I must be strong, I shouldn't stand out, people like me don't complain. 3. Institutional conditioning. Schooling, workplaces, religious institutions, and hierarchical structures create linguistic authority. Common imprints include follow the rules, don't challenge authority, mistakes are unacceptable, prove your worth. 4. Peer group tone. Social belonging shapes internal vocabulary. Sarcasm, banter, criticism, comparison, group norms, social currency. Internalized phrases include don't be weird, fit in, don't be too emotional. 5. Digital linguistic exposure algorithms now teach us microphrases, emotional templates, and conversational tone. This results in over-explanation, over-disclosure, self-branding, empathy, performativity, relatable linguistic mimicry, which creates inner phrases such as, I need to say this perfectly. People will judge this. I shouldn't sound like that. I shouldn't say this. But each of these layers adds sentences, rules, and tones to your internal lexicon. Understanding their origin is the first step toward authorship. The role of emotional memory. How phrases become physical. Every phrase in your inner lexicon has a physical component. This is because linguistic memory is not stored only in the brain, it is encoded somatically. Research on emotion, memory consolidation, and trauma, Ledoux, Porges, van der Kolk, Nader, shows that experiences associated with high emotional intensity leave stronger neural traces. If a childhood moment involved fear, shame, shock, humiliation, rejection, sudden anger, withdrawal of affection, the language used in that moment becomes hot-wired into the autonomic system. This is why certain inner phrases feel like tightness in the chest, constriction in the throat, a drop in the stomach, pressure behind the eye, shame, heat across the face, freezing in the limbs. These are not overreactions. They are somatic activations tied to linguistic imprints. When a phrase has been paired with high emotional intensity, it becomes a shortcut to a survival state. The opposite is also true. New phrases can be paired with regulated states, forming a new nervous system habitat. This is the core principle behind rewriting your inner lexicon. When the old lexicon no longer fits, many people reach adulthood with a lexicon designed for a different environment. A child who learned, don't upset the, stay quiet, keep everyone happy, may now be a highly competent adult who no longer needs those strategies. But the lexicon persists, not because it is useful, but because it is familiar. This creates a dissonance. The nervous system is speaking a language that no longer fits the life you've built. The goal is not to eliminate the old lexicon, but to recognize it as an earlier chapter, not the current one. Becoming conscious of your internal sentences. To rewrite your inner lexicon, you must first hear it. Most inner sentences run automatically. They fire before conscious thought. They shape perception instantly. To make them conscious, step 1. Identify your recurring internal statements. Pay attention to the phrases that appear during conflict, self-reflection, decision-making, anxiety, shame, disappointment, success, intimacy. These sentences reveal your emotional grammar. Step 2. Locate them in the body. Every phrase creates a somatic signature. I'm too much. Shoulders collapse. I shouldn't have said that. Throat tightens. I need to be careful. Stomach contracts. They're upset with me. Heart rate increases. Step 3. Separate the voice from the truth. Ask, who taught me this sentence? Does this still describe my reality, or just my conditioning? This step alone begins to dismantle the authority of inherited language. The digital mirror, algorithmic vocabulary. In the modern world, your inner lexicon is also shaped by something new, algorithmic linguistics. Platforms teach us microphrases, emotional templates, and acceptable tones. Performative vulnerability, curated relatability, aesthetic confession, humor as an emotional shield, moralistic phrasing, pseudo-academic language, trend dialects, identity slogan, algorithm-friendly sentence rhythms. These patterns slowly infiltrate the inner voice. This is not accidental. Algorithms reward predictability, and predictable language becomes profitable. The risk is that your inner lexicon becomes colonized by linguistic fashion rather than embodied truth. Part of authorship is recognizing which of my sentences belong to me and which belong to a platform. The purpose of this element 1, is about clarity. Understanding the architecture of the lexicon you inherited, recognizing how predictive coding locks old phrases in place, identifying the emotional grammar beneath your sentences, tracing language back to tone, environment, and early survival, noticing how digital culture shapes your internal vocabulary, seeing identity as a linguistic construction, not a fixed trait, beginning to hear the sentences that are outdated, misaligned, or untrue. You cannot rewrite a lexicon you cannot see. You cannot author a voice you cannot hear. You cannot inhabit a self you have not linguistically understood. This element is not the rewriting that comes later. This element is the awareness that makes rewriting possible. Now that you understand the architecture of the lexicon you inherited, the neural patterns, emotional grammar, cultural imprints, and digital influences that shaped your inner voice, we move to the next essential stage. Element 2, reclaiming the author seat, from inherited sentences to chosen language, where we will explore how to identify generational and cultural origins of inner phrases, how the body reveals which sentences are survival-based, how old lexicons become adulthood identity scripts, how to reclaim linguistic sovereignty without social exile, how to exit collective syntax and return to your own voice. So let's start element 2, reclaiming the author seat. The moment you realize that your inner lexicon was inherited rather than consciously chosen, a new challenge emerges, the question of authorship. If the voice inside you was assembled from parental tone, cultural pressure, institutional rules, and digital mimicry, then who exactly is speaking when you speak inside your own mind? More importantly, who should be speaking? Reclaiming the author seat is not about erasing history or rejecting the languages you were raised inside. It is about understanding that the sentences you inherited were functional responses to environments that no longer exist. Your nervous system learned to speak in the dialect of survival. Your identity was formed within that dialect. Now, to become an author of your inner life, you must learn to differentiate between the sentences that were needed once and the sentences that are needed now. This is a linguistic, psychological, and somatic transition. It is a shift from inheritance to autonomy. Reclaiming the author seat begins with recognizing that every phrase you use toward yourself sits on a timeline. Some phrases are childhood artifacts, stuck in the rhythm of early emotional environments. Others belong to adolescence, where social evaluation and belonging shaped tone. Some originate in institutional conditioning, the silent weight of should, must, prove, achieve, behave, and perform. More recently, digital culture may have furnished your lexicon with microphrases, self-deprecating humor, algorithm-friendly emotional tones, or the softened voice of online diplomacy. These all form layers in the linguistic sediment of the self. But authorship means choosing which layers remain active. The nervous system holds onto old language, not out of stubbornness, but out of efficiency. Predictive coding means the brain prefers the familiar. When a phrase has been repeated 1,000 times during childhood, it becomes a low-effort prediction. I should have known better is processed faster than I did what I could with the information I had. Don't upset them requires less cognitive energy, then their reaction is not my responsibility. Old sentences remain because they are metabolically cheap. They demand no new neural architecture. To reclaim authorship, you must be willing to expend the metabolic effort required to create a new syntax of self-perception. This is not merely a matter of thinking new thoughts. It involves restructuring the emotional grammar behind those thoughts, shifting autonomic cues, and teaching the body that a different rhythm of speech is safe. The nervous system must learn that new tone does not equal threat. This is where NSL, nervous system language, becomes life-adapting. NSL recognizes that every sentence has a physiological footprint. When you speak to yourself, the body reacts before the mind interprets. A harsh internal phrase triggers microconstriction across the chest, diaphragm, or throat. A shame-soaked sentence will drop the vagal brake and activate a cascade of defensive cues. A compassionate phrase lifts the vagal brake, initiating softening across facial muscles and breath rhythm. To reclaim authorship, you must first locate your inner language in the body. When a sentence emerges, pause long enough to identify its somatic signature. Notice what your shoulders do, what your jaw does, what your breath does, what your stomach does. This is not an intellectual exercise. The body tells you whether the phrase belongs to the present or the past. A sentence that contracts the body often belongs to a younger version of you, one who still believed that safety depended on compliance, harmony, or self-erasure. A sentence that expands the body signals linguistic alignment with current reality. This process also reveals which inherited sentences have become adulthood identity scripts. A childhood trained in hypervigilance will produce an adult who says, "I need to be careful." A childhood marked by emotional inconsistency will produce an adult who says, "I don't trust my reactions." A childhood where love was conditional will produce an adult who says, "I must not disappoint anyone." These internal sentences are not simply habits, they are survival predictions encoded through years of reinforcement. Reclaiming the author seat requires identifying the origin point of these scripts without collapsing into blame or nostalgia. Blame freezes growth. Nostalgia distorts memory. The task is to observe origin without reactivating it. When you encounter a recurring phrase, ask yourself, when did I learn this sentence? What state was I in? And does it still match the reality I live in? You are not seeking the accuracy of memory, but the accuracy of context. You are seeking to understand which sentences were functional in their time, but dysfunctional now. MLH, the mirror linguistic hypothesis, offers an important frame here. It proposes that language shapes identity not through meaning alone, but through the emotional state associated with its delivery. This means the tone used when a sentence is first heard becomes part of the message itself. A parent who says, "do your best" in a fearful tone teaches anxiety rather than encouragement. A teacher who says, "pay attention" with exasperation teaches shame more than focus. An institution that says, "this is for your own good" with coercive pressure teaches obedience, disguised as care. When you repeat these phrases to yourself, you are not repeating the content, you are repeating the tone. This tone becomes the architecture of your identity. Reclaiming authorship means separating content from tone, meaning from memory. You are not rewriting what was said, you are rewriting how your body hears it. Another dimension of authorship is recognizing how survival sentences become identity scripts in adulthood. The nervous system does not distinguish between external instruction and internal repetition. If you repeat a phrase internally long enough, your brain begins to treat it as a trait. "I should be better" becomes "I am inadequate." "Don't upset anyone" becomes "I am dangerous when I express myself." "I need to try harder" becomes "I am not enough." These transformations shape identity from the inside out. You do not simply think you are a certain way, your body reacts to you as if those sentences were factual descriptions. But identity can be rewritten through linguistic intervention. This does not require affirmation or artificially positive language. It requires precision. The goal is not to force new language, but to choose language that matches the person you have become rather than the person you were shaped to be. This is the distinction between survival narratives and chosen narratives. To reclaim authorship, begin by identifying the phrases that are not truly yours. Listen to your internal monologue as though listening to another person. Ask, whose voice does this resemble? You will notice parental phrases, cultural phrases, school phrases, peer phrases, institutional phrases, algorithmic phrases. These voices speak through you with familiarity because they were reinforced repeatedly when your nervous system was still forming. The real author seat begins to emerge when you realize you have been reciting a script written by others. Choosing new language is not simply about replacing phrases. It requires rewriting the emotional logic behind them. For example, consider the survival sentence, "I shouldn't upset anyone." Rewriting this sentence cognitively to, "I'm allowed to upset people" may sound assertive, but if the emotional grammar underneath is still tied to fear of conflict, the nervous system will not recognize the new sentence as safe. Instead, the new sentence must be paired with a state of regulation. In this example, a more precise rewrite might be, "I can be kind and honest at the same time." This maintains connection while expanding personal agency. The nervous system recognizes this as a possible pathway rather than a threat. Similarly, a survival sentence like "I'm always messing things up" cannot simply be replaced with "I know what I'm doing," because the emotional grammar of shame will reject the statement. A more aligned rewrite might be, "I make mistakes when I'm overwhelmed, not because I'm incapable." This avoids bypassing and instead introduces complexity, which the nervous system trusts more than forced optimism. Linguistic sovereignty is not about constructing perfect sentences. It is about constructing sentences that match your current nervous system capacity. If the sentence strengthens vagal stability, it belongs to you. If it tightens your throat or chest, it is inherited. A crucial part of reclaiming authorship is learning to exit collective syntax, the language patterns shaped by groups, ideologies, and digital ecosystems. Collective syntax produces familiar patterns, the softened voice of constant diplomacy, the exaggerated certainty of online discourse, the performative vulnerability of curated confession, the contrived humility of self-effacement, and the algorithm-friendly expressions of emotion. These patterns may be socially rewarded, but they mask true voice. The danger is that over time, you begin to speak to yourself using the same borrowed language. To leave collective syntax is not to abandon communities, but to differentiate your voice from the voices around you. This requires noticing when your internal phrasing shifts depending on the perceived audience. The presence of an imagined observer often triggers the internal editor, the part of you trained by shame, surveillance, culture, or social evaluation. This editor adjusts your sentences before they reach conscious awareness. It removes honesty in favor of acceptability. It dilutes anger, softens clarity, and rewrites desire into duty. It is the guardian of belonging at the cost of authenticity. Reclaiming the author seat means recognizing when the internal editor speaks. Each time you notice your internal language shifting toward what is acceptable rather than what is accurate, pause. Ask, who am I trying to sound safe for? The answer will reveal the source of linguistic conformity. Often, it is not the present-day social world, but the echoes of past relational dynamics. You may be responding to a parent's imagined disapproval, a teacher's scrutiny, a peer group's judgment, or a digital audience's expectations, even when alone. To reclaim authorship, you must replace the internal editor with internal translator. The translator does not suppress truth, but communicates it in a tone that maintains your own integrity. The translator understands that you do not need to choose between honesty and connection. You need only choose the vocabulary and pacing that regulate your body. Authentic language begins with embodied truth, not intellectual construction. Before choosing words, listen to what your body is communicating. Does it want to contract, expand, speak, or remain quiet? Does it want simplicity or detail? Does it want directness or softness? This is not emotional indulgence. It is the foundation of coherent communication. When your words follow your body rather than override it, you enter the author seat naturally. Digital environments complicate authorship because they reward speed, reaction, and visibility. But authorship requires slowness. It requires time for interoception to catch up to cognition. The nervous system cannot produce regulated language under algorithmic pressure. This is why many people feel that their digital voice sounds unlike their real one. The pace of speech becomes dictated by the environment rather than by the inner lexicon. To reclaim authorship online, you must practice speaking slowly in fast contexts. This is not only a psychological act, but a political one, choosing coherence over speed, nuance over performance, and self-attunement over approval. For many, the digital mirror becomes the primary space where they lose authorship. They begin writing for reaction, for validation, for belonging, for the metrics that reward conformity. The work here is recognizing when the algorithm has become a co-author of your inner voice. One of the most powerful questions you can ask in reclaiming authorship is, which sentence no longer fits who I am now? This question disrupts predictive coding and forces the brain to re-evaluate linguistic assumptions. When you ask this question repeatedly, your identity begins to reorganize itself around present-day truth rather than inherited narratives. It takes time because the body will resist new language until it feels safe inside it. But each time you challenge an outdated sentence, you expand the nervous system's capacity to inhabit new patterns of internal speech. Reclaiming the author seat is not a single act. It is an ongoing discipline. It requires continuous differentiation between inherited, culturally imposed, algorithmically encouraged, and self-authored language. It requires patience with the nervous system as it learns to recognize new tone as safety rather than threat. It requires vigilance against internalized surveillance. And it requires tenderness, because rewriting an inner lexicon means tending to the youngest parts of the self, the ones who learned to speak only in the language of survival. But as you continue this process, something profound happens. The sentences that once governed your identity lose their authority. The old lexicon begins to dissolve. You notice that you are speaking to yourself differently, more precisely, more honestly, more slowly, more compassionately. The body softens into a new linguistic habitat, and gradually, by sentence, by tone, by breath, you reclaim authorship over your inner world. This is the foundation upon which linguistic sovereignty is built. Without authorship, sovereignty is impossible. With authorship, sovereignty becomes natural. Now we have discussed how inherited sentences formed your inner identity, and how to reclaim authorship over that internal language. We move into the next phase, element 3, linguistic sovereignty. How to speak without permission, where we explore the nervous system mechanics of collapsed voice, the difference between embodied truth and appeasing tone, how to dismantle the internal editor trained by shame, culture, and surveillance, how to stabilize your voice even in environments that reward conformity, how to choose pacing, tone, and rhythm that reflect sovereignty, how to stop seeking approval before honesty, how to maintain coherence in reaction-driven digital cultures. There comes a point in any internal transformation where technique, theory, and self-awareness meet a deeper threshold. The moment you realize that almost everything you've been calling your voice is a product of adaptation. Not intentional, not chosen, not authored, but rehearsed in order to survive environments that demanded compliance, predictability, or emotional neutrality. This element examines the quiet architecture of that compliance and the psychological mechanics that collapse the voice long before words are ever spoken. Linguistic sovereignty doesn't begin with expression. It begins with recovering access to the nervous system states that make expression possible. Without that access, every attempt at honesty is filtered through the same internal editor that trained itself to keep the peace, reduce visibility, or maintain connection at any cost. What we call permission is rarely external. Most often, it is the body waiting for a cue of safety that was never present when voice was originally shaped. To understand sovereignty, we begin with how the voice collapses, the mechanics of collapsed voice. When people talk about not speaking up, they tend to frame it as a matter of confidence or assertiveness. But the physiology tells a different story. The nervous system collapses voice for the same reason it collapses posture, breath, or gaze, to minimize threat. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory makes this clear. In states of social safety, ventral vagal activation, the larynx relaxes, breath stabilizes, and vocal tone becomes flexible and resonant. In sympathetic states, fight-flight, tone sharpens or pushes. In dorsal vagal collapse, shutdown, vocalization can become flat, restricted, or go completely offline. This means that many people who believe they lack confidence are actually experiencing an autonomic state where speech is physiologically inhibited. The difficulty is not mental, it is neurobiological. This distinction matters because trying to fix a nervous system phenomenon with purely cognitive tools often leads to frustration. You can tell someone speak your truth 1,000 times, but if their body perceives honesty as a threat, the voice will not comply. In this sense, voice collapse is not failure, it is fidelity to past survival conditions. Most adults carry an internal hierarchy of allowed speech. It's rarely explicit. It's encoded through thousands of interactions where tone was corrected, emotion was discouraged, or honesty was met with withdrawal. The nervous system internalizes the lesson. It is safer to edit than to express. Linguistic sovereignty requires reversing this hierarchy, not by force, but by re-establishing autonomic conditions under which expression does not equal danger. The internal editor, a survival algorithm. One of the most persistent obstacles to sovereignty is what we can call the internal editor, the silent evaluator that reviews every thought before it reaches speech. It's not simply psychological self-doubt. It is a behavioral strategy shaped by three primary influences. 1. Shame conditioning, internalized messages about what is too much, too emotional, too intense, or inappropriate. 2. Cultural socialization, linguistic norms that reward conformity, politeness, or linguistic minimalism. 3. Surveillance environments, family or institutional systems where the wrong tone could lead to conflict, punishment, or emotional withdrawal. Over time, the editor becomes automated. People speak in pre-cleared sentences, rehearsed scripts. Isn't the weather awful lately? Being such an example in the United Kingdom, and emotionally diluted phrasing. Tone becomes soft to avoid friction. Content becomes generic to avoid scrutiny. Rhythm becomes truncated to minimize disruption. The tragedy is not the editing itself. It's that most people believe this is their actual voice. From the perspective of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, MLH, the internal editor is not merely psychological. It is a form of linguistic mimicry. The nervous system adopts the rhythm and tone of whichever authority figure ensured survival. If criticism came sharply, the editor sharpens its tone. If affection required smallness, the editor miniaturizes language. If anger was forbidden, the editor removes emotional charge from speech. The consequence is predictable. Adulthood communication becomes a negotiation, not an expression. The voice becomes a curated performance designed to prevent relational loss. Sovereignty requires reclaiming authorship from this editor, not by eliminating it, but by updating the survival logic that governs it. Appeasing tone versus embodied truth. A large part of linguistic sovereignty involves learning to recognize the difference between appeasing tone and embodied truth. Appeasing tone sounds cooperative on the surface, but it is structured around three internal rules. Do not threaten the other person's comfort. Do not reveal emotional intensity. Do not risk disapproval. These rules are learned early and become automatic strategies. They show up in subtle ways. Apologizing before speaking, softening statements with qualifiers. I might be wrong, but or modulating tone to sound agreeable, even when discussing difficult topics. Embodied truth, by contrast, is not aggressive. It is simply unedited. It does not shrink to avoid discomfort, nor inflate to create distance. It reflects the internal state accurately, without distortion. The nervous system difference between the two is profound. Appeasement is top-down. The mind manipulates tone to maintain safety. Embodied truth is bottom-up. The body stabilizes sufficiently to allow unfiltered speech. This is why sovereignty is not about pushing yourself to be more honest. It is about cultivating the physiological state that makes honesty tolerable to your system. It is also why some people feel more truthful when calm and more dishonest when anxious. Anxiety activates prediction mechanisms that amplify the internal editor. The self becomes preoccupied with anticipated consequences, which compromises authenticity. Reclaiming sovereignty requires noticing when your voice is being shaped by fear of outcome rather than integrity of meaning. The nervous system cost of approval-seeking speech approval-seeking creates a linguistic loop that feels emotionally safe, but is physiologically costly. Each time you speak for acceptance rather than expression, the body reinforces the message. My voice is conditional. This triggers subtle patterns, micro hesitations before answering, breath holding before honesty, a tonal shift into appeasement when conflict is possible, post-spoken rumination. Did I say that wrong? These symptoms reveal an internal conflict between authenticity and approval, a conflict that often doesn't arise because others demand perfection, but because the nervous system has been conditioned to anticipate relational threat. The problem is not the desire for connection. Humans are wired for attachment. The problem is when the connection becomes contingent on self-erasure. The more you rely on approval-based speech, the more the nervous system attributes safety to suppression. This creates a dependency. The self must constantly monitor tone and content to maintain harmony. This is why sovereignty is not optional. Without reclaiming it, voice becomes a tool of self-control rather than self-expression, releasing the permission-seeking reflex. One of the most deeply embedded linguistic reflexes is the need for permission, not literal permission, but emotional permission, the sense that expression must be justified, softened, or pre-approved. This reflex has several origins. Households where children were expected to be quiet, compliant, or undemanding. School environments that rewarded conformity and punished dissenting tones. Social norms that teach people, especially women, minorities, or neurodivergent individuals, to minimize their presence. Digital cultures where any misphrasing or misalignment can lead to public correction. When these influences converge, the body internalizes one rule: speak only when it is safe enough, acceptable enough, and beneficial enough. Linguistic sovereignty involves interrupting that reflex, not by forcing boldness or aggression, but by establishing internal safety that is not dependent on external validation. This doesn't mean disregarding context or ignoring the emotional landscape of others. It means not assigning them the role of gatekeeper to your expression. One practical marker of sovereignty is this: you no longer wait for the imagined approval of others before speaking. You evaluate whether your own nervous system can hold the truth you're expressing, and you build capacity from there. Digital environments and the erosion of voice digital culture creates a complex challenge for linguistic sovereignty. On one hand, online spaces offer unprecedented expression. On the other hand, they amplify self-surveillance and reactive communication. Three digital dynamics undermine sovereignty. 1. Speed. Platforms reward rapid reactions, not regulated responses. 2. Visibility. Speech is archived, judged, and algorithmically ranked. 3. Homogeneity. Trends shape tone, vocabulary, and emotional expression. The result is what we can call algorithmic mimicry. People unconsciously adopt linguistic patterns that will be understood, rewarded, or amplified by the platform. This includes short-form emotional signaling, performative vulnerability, predictable opinion formats, cadence shaped by virality rather than authenticity. The consequence is a form of digital linguistic assimilation. The voice adapts to a cultural medium that prioritizes engagement metrics over coherence. Maintaining sovereignty in digital spaces requires three practices: slow speech in fast environments, pacing that matches your physiology, not the algorithm, tone that is anchored in regulation rather than reaction. It is not easy, but it is essential. Digital spaces cannot shape your nervous system vocabulary if you are consciously choosing the state from which you communicate. Language as an autonomic boundary. One overlooked aspect of linguistic sovereignty is understanding language as a boundary. Tone, pacing, and clarity set limits more effectively than explicit statements. For example, a regulated voice signals, I am present but not porous. A coherent rhythm signals, I will not rush to meet your discomfort. A clear statement signals, I am not waiting for emotional permission to exist. Many people were never taught that vocal boundaries exist. They were taught to say no, but not how to embody the tone that makes no coherent. They were taught to speak clearly, but not how to maintain autonomic stability that makes clarity sustainable. Sovereignty restores this, the ability to use language as a boundary that protects the integrity of selfhood without aggression. Reclaiming internal authority. Linguistic sovereignty ultimately comes down to authority. Who has the final say over your voice, your nervous system, or someone else's imagined reaction? Most people give authority to the latter without realizing it. They adjust tone, soften statement, or withhold truth because they unconsciously assume that the emotional landscape of others is more important than their own physiological integrity. This assumption is learned, not innate. Reclaiming internal authority involves three shifts: from anticipatory compliance to present moment coherence, from external approval to internal alignment, from fear-driven editing to state-dependent truthfulness. When internal authority is restored, speech becomes an extension of embodied truth rather than an expression of fear management. This shift is not abrupt. It is incremental, but it is irreversible once felt. When you experience the ease of speaking from regulation rather than appeasement, the nervous system recognizes it as a more coherent way of being. Reflection prompt. Where does my voice still seek approval before honesty, and what would my body feel like if it no longer needed permission to speak? This question is not rhetorical. It is diagnostic. It reveals the exact locations where sovereignty is still fragmented and where the internal editor maintains control. Digital mirror. Maintaining coherence in reaction culture's online environments accelerate emotion. Outrage, urgency, moralism, and rapid-fire opinions create a linguistic ecosystem where slowness can feel like invisibility, but sovereignty requires slowness. Reaction cultures dissolve nuance. They reward emotionally charged language, instant commentary, and conformity to group narratives. Within these environments, coherence is an act of resistance. Coherence does not mean withdrawal. It means speaking in a rhythm that aligns with your physiology rather than the tempo of the platform. It means allowing space between stimulus and speech. It means anchoring tone in self-regulation rather than collective reactivity. Most importantly, it means maintaining linguistic integrity, even when the surrounding culture encourages reduction, simplification, or binary expression. Sovereignty survives in digital spaces only when you refuse to outsource your tone to algorithms. To understand sovereignty fully, we now need to examine how language functions as a living organism inside the nervous system, constantly updating, reshaping itself, and evolving with experience. The next element looks directly at this ecological process. How inner vocabulary grows, adapts, collapses, and renews itself across relationship, memories, digital environments, and embodied states. We move now into Element 4, Integration Insight, your nervous system vocabulary as a living organism. One of the most important insights in the study of language and the nervous system is that the inner lexicon, the total library of phrases, tones, reflexive scripts, and embodied meanings you carry, is not static. It is alive. It adapts, mutates, decays, repairs, and reorganizes according to experience. Most people imagine their inner voice as something fixed, a personality trait, a mental habit, or a stable psychological identity. But in reality, it behaves far more like an ecosystem, dynamic, interdependent, and constantly interacting with internal and external environments. In neuroscience, this concept finds an analog in neuroplasticity, the organism's capacity to reorganize itself based on repetition, attention, and emotional salience. Language is one of the primary carriers of emotional salience. Every sentence you repeat becomes a neural groove. Every tone you internalize becomes a predictive model. Every message inherited from childhood becomes part of your cognitive soil, influencing the next generation of thoughts as surely as nutrients shape the growth of a plant. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis, MLH perspective, the inner lexicon is shaped through mirroring loops. Early relational tone, cultural script, digital dialects, and adult experiences all contribute to the evolving vocabulary of self. But what matters most, and what this element explore, is that this vocabulary is not a passive repository. It is an entire internal ecosystem that you are capable of pruning, tending, and rewiring. To understand this, we need to look at how inner language functions as a living organism. Language as neuroplastic practice. Everything you say to yourself becomes structurally embedded, not metaphorically, but literally. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition, and the nervous system begins to anticipate certain internal messages before events unfold. Take, for example, a phrase like, "I always mess things up." If this sentence is repeated often enough, either internally or through the mirrored tone of caregiver, the nervous system internalizes it as both truth and prediction. It becomes a lexical scaffold, a structure through which future experiences are filtered and interpreted. Predictive coding theory, widely referenced in cognitive neuroscience, explains that the brain constantly tries to minimize surprise by pre-guessing outcomes. This means if your inner lexicon is dominated by self-blame, caution, or hypervigilance, then your predictions and your interpretations will be shaped by those linguistic expectations. Your nervous system gradually learns to assume failure before effort, disappointment before risk, rejection before vulnerability, conflict before expression. And because the body prepares for its predictions, the physiological state reflects the sentence, not the situation. This is why changing inner vocabulary is not superficial. It is a neurobiological transformation. When you shift from punitive, inherited sentences to regulated, self-authored ones, you are not simply thinking differently. You are reorganizing autonomic pathways that alter perception, posture, breath, and emotional capacity. Language doesn't sit on top of the nervous system. It grows through it. The ecology of tone in relationships, just as ecosystems respond to climate, the inner lexicon responds to relational tone. Humans develop linguistic reflexes to maintain connection, and those reflexes change depending on the relational environment. For instance, in safe environments, tone becomes open, fluid, and exploratory. In unstable environments, tone becomes monitored, cautious, or muted. In hierarchical environments, tone becomes deferential or performative. In dismissive environments, tone becomes apologetic or self-effacing. In unpredictable environments, tone oscillates between pleasing and guarding. These shifts are not cognitive decisions. They are autonomic adjustments. If you grew up navigating inconsistent or emotionally volatile caregivers, your body learned that tone is not just communication, it is survival. This creates a relational ecosystem where your inner lexicon becomes populated with phrases that prioritize safety over truth. Don't make it worse. Stay small. Wait your turn. Don't upset them. Be grateful. These phrases then anchor themselves deeply, becoming default survival language in adulthood. When conflict arises or vulnerability is required, the nervous system returns to the most familiar linguistic pathways. not because they are true, but because they are predictable. As a result, the inner lexicon becomes filled with outdated survival scripts that no longer match the adult reality. Integration requires recognizing which parts of your internal vocabulary belong to previous relational climates and consciously deciding whether they still deserve to survive in your nervous system. Contextual vocabulary, how language shifts across environments. Many people believe they have one voice, but in reality, most carry multiple dialects depending on context. The voice used at work, the voice used in intimate relationships, the voice used online, the voice used internally when stressed, the voice used when alone. Each dialect is shaped by different survival demands. For example, your professional dialect may prioritize precision and neutrality, while your relational dialect may prioritize softness and emotional attunement. Your online dialect may emphasize brevity or performance. Your internal dialect may fluctuate depending on physiological state. This multiplicity isn't a flaw, it's adaptive. Humans are socially complex, but problems arise when one particular dialect, usually the survival one, becomes dominant, infiltrating situations where it is no longer appropriate. A person who learned to use apologetic language as a child may bring that into professional settings unnecessarily. Someone who learned to minimize themselves around caregivers may minimize themselves in friendships without realizing it. The question is not whether we shift dialects. The question is whether the dialects we use are chosen or inherited. An integrated lexicon allows you to move between dialects intentionally, rather than unconsciously repeating past adaptations. Digital ecology, updating online tone. In digital spaces, the inner lexicon encounters a different kind of ecosystem, one shaped by visibility, algorithms, and social feedback loops. Online environments reward fast, simplified language and penalize nuance and slowness. Because of this, many people internalize digital dialects that become part of their nervous system vocabulary. Short, emotionally compressed sentences, performative vulnerability, moralized phrasing, humor masking insecurity, curated self-expression. If repeated often enough, these patterns don't remain online. They seep into internal monologue, shaping how people think about themselves and others. But digital environments also offer an opportunity, the chance to update tone consciously. By choosing to post or communicate from regulation rather than reaction, you introduce new rhythms, new semantic, and new patterns into the internal lexicon. Online silence also becomes part of the vocabulary. Choosing not to post, not to respond instantly, or not to participate in reactive discourse introduces a new nervous system grammar, rest as expression. This is not disengagement. It is autonomy, language as daily practice. Because the inner lexicon is a living organism, it requires ongoing tending. Just as ecosystems need maintenance, pruning, reseeding, removing invasive species, so does your inner linguistic ecology. This does not require constant vigilance. It requires awareness. 3 daily practices help maintain a coherent internal vocabulary. 1. Noticing outdated sentences. When a habitual phrase arises, I can't do this, it's all my fault, they'll be upset. Treat it as an old branch that can be trimmed, but not with force, but with clarity. This sentence belongs to an older version of me. 2. Replacing survival tone with regulated tone, not by faking positivity, but by shifting into accurate, grounded language. I'm struggling, but I'm still capable. This is difficult, but not impossible. I don't need to collapse to stay safe. 3. Allowing language to evolve. Just as experience evolves, so should inner vocabulary. If a phrase no longer fits the person you're becoming, allow it to die. If a new tone emerges, calmer, clearer, slower, let it grow. Most importantly, stay attuned to the physiological states that produce each sentence. Your nervous system is the soil. Your sentences are the plants. If the soil shifts, the plants must adapt. Reflection prompt. Ask yourself, what words bring me home and which exile me? This prompt forms the foundation of integrating your living lexicon. Every sentence carries you closer to yourself or further away. Your task is to notice which direction your vocabulary pulls you. We've now explored how your inner language behaves like a living organism, dynamic, adaptive, shaped by environment and experience. The next step is not merely understanding this ecology, but engaging it actively. In the final element of this episode, we turn toward integration, how to build and maintain a nervous system vocabulary that reflects who you are now, not who you had to be. We move next into element 5, integration practice and closing whisper, returning to yourself. There comes a moment at the end of any deep psychological and linguistic journey when the only question that remains is deceptively simple. Integration practice. Building a vocabulary worth living. In what language will you live in now? Not what language were you given, not what language you performed, not what language others demanded from you, but the living lexicon you will consciously author from this point forward. This final element is about the authorship, not the romantic kind, not the poetic revelation, but the slow, disciplined, nervous system aligned work of crafting a vocabulary that supports your actual life, not the survival strategies of your past. A lexicon is never just words. It is a habitat, a climate, a regulatory environment. It shapes how your nervous system anticipates the world, interprets the present, and prepares for the future. The question now is no longer, where did these sentences come from? You already know. It's no longer, does this inner language belong to me? You've already discovered that much of it does not. This element asks something else entirely. What does a nervous system sound like when it is finally speaking its own language? This is not a metaphor. There are genuine cognitive, physiological, and behavioral consequences to the lexicon you choose to maintain. We will take this in 3 layers. 1. The nervous system mechanics of language consolidation. 2. The daily practice of replacing inherited scripts with chosen ones. 3. Rewiring voice tone and internal grammar through real-time NSL, nervous system language, and MLH, mirror linguistic hypothesis. And finally, we'll close this entire layer with a grounding whisper, not flashy, not performative, but a simple resting place for everything you've learned. Let's continue. The nervous system consolidates language through repetition, not insight. One of the most important truths in all of psycholinguistics, and one that most people never hear, is this. Your nervous system doesn't update because you understand something. It updates because you practice it. Insight is not integration. Realization is not rewiring. Awareness is not authorship. Understanding where your inner language came from was essential. Tracing the root scripts of childhood, culture, shame, hierarchy, and digital pressure, all necessary. But none of that rewrites the lexicon unless you do the work of repetition, replacement, and regulation. Neuroplastic change follows a simple rule. Neurons that fire together wire together, Hebb's law. Which means, if you continue thinking about an old sentence, even after understanding its origins, your brain still treats it as truth. Insight does not override repetition. Repetition overrides insight. This is why, after all the depth of layer 3, you may still feel an old phrase slip back in. Not because you failed, but because the brain is designed to conserve familiar patterns until new ones become embodied. Your living lexicon begins with this acceptance. Old language will echo, but you no longer need to obey it. The goal is not to silence old phrases. Silencing is just another form of bracing. The goal is to outgrow them. A lexicon becomes obsolete not through suppression, but through lack of use. When the nervous system experiences a new pattern consistently enough, it adopts it as normal. That is where sovereignty begins. Rewriting survival sentences into present tense truth. Many inner phrases originally had a purpose. A child uses language like scaffolding. Don't upset them. Stay quiet. Be good. Don't be too much. Say what they want to hear. These were not abstract rules. They were survival codes in linguistic form. The adult nervous system, however, often continues living inside these codes long after they've served their function. Rewriting your lexicon is not about being more positive. It is about being more accurate. Survival sentences speak about the past. Chosen sentences speak about the present. Consider a survival script like, it's safer if I don't say anything. In a disruptive childhood or unpredictable relational environment, that was probably true. The body remembers it because the body survived it. But now, perhaps it's no longer true. Perhaps silence is costing you connection, presence, expression, authenticity, and alignment. The task is not to shame the old sentence. It kept you alive, but it must be updated. A present tense sentence might be, I can pause to regulate before I speak and still honor my voice. This is the essence of linguistic sovereignty. Not swinging between self-abandonment and aggression, but choosing language that reflects current safety, current agency, and current context. That is the active creation of a living lexicon. The practice of noticing, micro-recognition as rewiring before a sentence can be rewritten, it has to be noticed. Most inner language operates automatically at sub-second speed, the predictive coding system preloading interpretations and emotional responses before consciousness arrives. So the first step of integration is not dramatic, it is observational. Can I notice the sentence I'm about to say to myself? What does your inner narrator default to when? Do you feel embarrassed? Do you disappoint someone? You're about to express a need? You're overwhelmed? You're praised? You succeed? You rest? You're silent? Each of these moments carries an embedded linguistic reflex. Some people tighten into self-criticism. Some collapse into silence. Some inflate into performance. Some numb out into dissociation. The nervous system runs language like muscle memory. When noticing becomes a practice instead of a rare accident, the entire lexicon becomes visible. A sentence cannot hold you captive once you recognize it as a sentence, rather than a fact. The NSL ritual for rewriting the inner voice. The NSL method you've been using throughout this entire layer integrates seamlessly into lexicon building. Your vocabulary becomes nervous system aware when you follow this sequence. Pause, breathe, sensory voice. Pause. Interrupt the preloaded survival script before it becomes the entire narrative. Breathe, regulation first. A dysregulated brain cannot update language. It only recycles it. Sense. Locate the bodily tension, contraction, or pull that accompanies the old sentence. This is crucial. If you change the words without changing the physiology, the sentence does not update. Revoice. Speak a new sentence that matches your present context, capacity, and identity. This is not affirmation. This is neuro-linguistic precision. Examples. Old, I always make everything worse. New, I can respond differently now that I understand my patterns. Old, I need to fix this or they'll leave. New, connection survives honesty more than performance. Old, I'm too sensitive. New, my sensitivity gives me information. It isn't a flaw. Old, it's my fault if they're upset. New, I am responsible for my impact, not for managing another person's entire nervous system. The goal is not to feel instantly transformed. The goal is to build a vocabulary that matches your reality rather than your history. Digital lexicon, clearing the algorithmic noise. A large portion of your language was shaped not by family or culture, but by platforms optimized to capture and direct attention. Algorithms reward short emotional spikes, certainty, conformity, simplicity, outrage, virtue signals, shareable sentiment. They do not reward nuance, regulation, or reflective honesty. This means online environments mass produce linguistic reflexes that do not belong to you. You've probably absorbed sentences that feel natural only because the feed rewarded them. I should have a take on this. I need to post more consistently. Everyone must know this right now. If I don't say something, it means I don't care. I need to prove I'm healing. These are not inner truths. They are algorithmic imperatives disguised as self-talk. A living lexicon requires pruning the digital noise, not abandoning platforms entirely, but consciously recognizing, what tone do I use online that I would never use when regulated offline? Your nervous system vocabulary cannot grow accurately if the feed keeps injecting borrowed grammar and emotional templates. Integration in the digital age means reclaiming authorship of your words, even when the environment encourages performance. Identity scripts, linguistic residue from every layer of your past. You contain multiple versions of yourself: old selves, provisional selves, restrained selves, adaptive selves. Each version had its own lexicon. The child who needed to survive learned one set of phrases. The adolescent who needed belonging learned another. The adult navigating culture, work, relationships, trauma, and pressure adopted even more. These scripts stack, they blend, they contradict, they overlap, they negotiate dominant. Element 3 in this layer showed you the phenomenon of linguistic sovereignty, the ability to speak without permission. Now we add a final nuance. Sovereignty requires choosing which self speaks, not rejecting the others, not shaming them, not pretending they're gone, but consciously selecting the voice that matches who you are now. Your inner lexicon becomes living when it becomes curated. You don't silence the younger self. You update their grammar. You don't eradicate the protective voice. You teach it nuance. You don't dismiss the anxious narrator. You provide it with new predictive cues. A lexicon becomes a home when every inner voice is allowed to speak, but none are allowed to dominate by default. The body as the editor of your lexicon. The final authority of your language is not your mind. It is your nervous system. A sentence is true for you only when your body softens in response to it. This means, if the sentence tightens your chest, it's not aligned. If it constricts your throat, it's not yours. If it makes your breath shallow, it's from the past. If it creates a collapse, it's a survival echo. If it creates urgency, it's algorithmic scripting. A living lexicon is a physiological phenomenon, not merely a linguistic one. This is where NSL meets MLH. NSL asks how the sentence regulates or dysregulates the nervous system. MLH asks which relational context the sentence was originally shaped by. Together they reveal this truth. Your vocabulary must evolve at the pace of your nervous system, not the pace of your expectations. Insight runs fast. Embodiment runs slowly. Language becomes living when it honors the slower rhythm. The final premise before we close a lexicon is alive when it meets 3 conditions. 1. It reflects your current truth. 2. It regulates your nervous system instead of destabilizing it. 3. It aligns with the identity you are actively becoming, not the one you inherited. This is the threshold we now stand on. There is a moment in every inner transformation when the work becomes less about learning something new and more about protecting what you've already reclaimed. Most people underestimate this. They assume healing is a single upward trajectory, clarity earned once and kept forever. But language doesn't work this way, because the nervous system doesn't work this way. Both are living processes, adaptive, relational, permeable. By the time you arrive here, episode 30, the end of layer 3, you've developed a fluency in your internal language that didn't exist before. You hear yourself differently. You speak from a different center. You recognize inherited phrases the moment they enter your mouth. You feel when your tone is trying to appease, retract, or disappear. But now comes the most difficult part: remaining authored inside environments that still want you to speak the old way. This is where everything you've learned becomes practice. This is the territory of integration, not the moment of insight, but the moment after, when life continues, people continue, pressures continue, and you're faced with the question: will I speak from who I am now, or from whom the world has trained me to be? This final section is about holding the line. The 3 pulls back into old language. 3 primary forces attempt to pull you back into the vocabulary you've now outgrown. Integration means learning to recognize them quickly and consciously. 1. Social contour pressure. Every environment has its own contour, the acceptable tones, pace, expression, and emotional bandwidth that mark someone as belonging. When you begin speaking from embodiment rather than performance, you disrupt the contour. You feel too slow in fast environments, too honest in polite circles, or too regulated in groups addicted to drama. This is not a failure. It is an indication that your voice has changed, and the room hasn't. Integration means learning to sense this pressure without collapsing into it, responding from presence rather than social gravity. 2. Nervous system reflex. Even after deep inner work, the body remembers the efficiency of old patterns. Under stress, your system may momentarily reach for phrases that once kept you safe. Sorry, I didn't mean to. It's fine. Don't worry about it. I'm okay, really. You're right, I'm overreacting. These aren't character flaws. They are stored reflexes. And reflexes diminish only through repetition, not shame. Integration isn't about eliminating them, but catching them earlier and choosing differently. 3. Algorithmic echo. Every digital platform has a tone, a speed, a reward system, a preferred emotional register, and without meaning to, you start to internalize it. Shorter sentences, more performative certainty, faster emotional pivots, carefully crafted relatability, softened truths to avoid correction, exaggerated truths to gain engagement. When you continue to use these patterns offline, you begin losing your internal center. You start speaking like someone performing their inner world rather than living it. Integration requires an awareness of how digital cadence infiltrates personal cadence and a commitment to reclaiming your own rhythm, the discipline of authored speech. The purpose of this final element is not to give you more information, but to help you cultivate a discipline, a way of relating to your inner language that carries you far beyond this season. This discipline rests on 3 practices. 1. Slow before you speak, not because slow is better, but because slow is sovereign. Slowness in conversation signals 3 things to the nervous system. I am not reacting. I am not collapsing. I am choosing. This breaks the historical pattern where your voice was conditioned to emerge from fear, urgency, or appeasement. The pause interrupts the old neural pathway long enough for a new one to form. It also teaches others something quietly powerful. Your voice is not available for unconscious extraction. 2. Name what you hear. A central part of integration is the skill of naming your internal language while it's happening. For example, that sentence didn't sound like me. I feel my tone pulling inward. I hear that this apology is a reflex, not a truth. My body tightened before I answered. Awareness turns an unconscious habit into a conscious choice. Naming is the hinge between old vocabulary and new authorship. 3. Translate yourself back into truth. Translation is the heart of this element, the ability to take an inherited sentence and consciously rewrite it into alignment. Old sentence: I should have handled that better. New translation: I understand why I reacted that way. Old: I can't say that, they'll get upset. New: I can be honest without abandoning kindness. Old: I need to fix this right now. New: I can respond from clarity, not urgency. Translation is not emotional bypass. It is linguistic self-regulation, the deliberate reauthoring of your nervous system's narrative, when your inner voice upgrades faster than your life. One of the most challenging aspects of integration is the mismatch between your internal evolution and your external world. Your voice grows faster than your relationships. Your tone matures before your dynamics do. Your clarity deepens before your environment recognizes it. This is normal. In fact, it's inevitable. You are no longer using the same inner lexicon you once survived with. But the people around you may still be speaking to the older version of your nervous system, the one you no longer inhabit. Integration is the process of holding your new language steady long enough for your life to rearrange around it. This does not mean cutting everyone out, nor does it mean performing your growth. It means you stop contorting your truth for comfort. It means your tone changes even when the room doesn't. It means you express with coherence instead of compliance. Your living lexicon reshapes reality slowly, but unmistakably. The long arc of nervous system authorship. The nervous system doesn't rewrite itself in a single moment. It rewrites itself through accumulation, each pause, each translation, each moment of self-directed clarity. You are establishing a long arc, a trajectory of being someone whose inner voice is no longer inherited, reflexive, or algorithmically shaped, but authored. This arc is built from small, quiet, consistent practices. The tone you use in self-correction, the words you choose when you fail, the rhythm you speak with under pressure, the honesty you allow yourself in private, the boundaries you express without anger, the apologies you stop giving unnecessarily, the way you name reality inside your own chest. Each is a rehearsal for the world you are creating inside yourself. A final return to the voice you've built by now. You understand something most people never do. Language is not merely communication, it is embodiment. Your voice is not just a tool, it is a living system. Your sentences are not random, they are adaptive responses. Your tone is not accidental, it is neurobiological information. Your vocabulary is not fixed, it is plastic and evolving. Your inner dialogue is not private, it shapes your physiology. Your words are not ornaments, they are anchors. And most importantly, you are the author now. Not the child you once were, not the culture that shaped you, not the algorithm that influences you, not the voices that trained you to be smaller, not the narratives that kept your identity confined. Your lexicon is alive, and it belongs to you. This doesn't mean perfection. It simply means presence. It means authorship instead of autopilot. It means coherence instead of collapse. It means choosing your language instead of inheriting it. The rest of your life becomes a practice of returning again and again to the voice you have built consciously. This is the beginning of a lifelong fluency, the lexicon that lives with you. Before we close layer 3 in this episode, I want to leave you with this. Language is not what you speak. Language is what speaks through you. When you change your inner vocabulary, you change your nervous system. When you change your nervous system, you change your choices. When you change your choices, you change your life. Your living lexicon is not a destination. It is a companion, evolving, responsive, honest, and it will continue to unfold long after this episode ends. Thank you for walking this far with me. For every moment of reflection, for every sentence you've rewritten, for every instinct you've learned to trust, for every fragment of inherited language you've released, for every breath you've taken before speaking, for every quiet act of authorship, you have not just learned a new language, you've remembered your own. Until next time, thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to Mirror Talk, the language of the nervous system. I'm James Miller,